That's so cute. So when I was planning the opening to this sermon, I did not remember that we were going to show this great, lighthearted, funny video and then transition into the topic for today, which is not an easy transition because we are talking about demons and possessions and exorcism. And so I'm just going to jump right into it. And so we will ask you this question. How many of you have ever seen the movie The Exorcist? Okay, quite a lot of people. So this movie, interestingly, my parents had this sort of strange theology of movies. Like, they wouldn't let me watch Dirty Dancing, but they did let me watch The Exorcist. Maybe that explains a lot of trauma I have, but this movie terrified me. It's actually one of the highest grossing films of all time. It had significant pop culture influence, and it is consistently rated in one of the top scariest movies of all time. This professor, Deborah Whitehead, who is the chair of the Department of Religious Studies at CU Boulder, she studies religion and its intersection in American culture. She says this: the film had a big cultural impact. In particular, it was actually very significant in influencing evangelicals' conceptions of evil and possession. So it was directed by this man named William Friedkin. And I came across this fascinating article in Vanity Fair where Friedkin talks about his experience. And he admits that before he directed the film, he had never actually witnessed an exorcism. In fact, he says that he is agnostic. He believes that the power of God and the human soul are unknowable. And so before he was approached to direct this film, he said he had no interest in the supernatural or in anything spiritual. But he wanted to try and make the movie as realistic as possible. And so he says this: I made the film believing in the reality of exorcism and never to this day thought of it as a horror film. Now, his curiosity, once he made the movie, he began to become even more interested in the spiritual and supernatural. So it leads him to go to Italy. And he goes to Italy to meet this Catholic vicar named Father Amorth, who was known as the Vatican exorcist and Rome's chief exorcist, who performed thousands of exorcisms. And so while he's there, he watches this exorcism of a woman named Rosa, and he films it. And then his intention is to bring the film back, present it to scientific researchers and psychiatrists to get a credible scientific opinion of what he witnessed. So he takes it to leading neurosurgeons in California and a group of prominent psychiatrists in New York. And so after watching the video, Dr. Neil Martin, the chief neurosurgeon at UCLA Medical Center, said this: there's a significant force at work within her somehow. I don't know the underlying origin of it. It doesn't seem to be hallucinations or schizophrenia or epilepsy. I've done thousands of surgery on brain tumors, traumatic brain injuries, and I haven't seen this kind of consequence from any of those disorders. This goes beyond anything I've ever experienced. Then he shows it to Dr. Isaac Fried, a neurosurgeon who specializes in seizure disorders. And his conclusion was this: it looks like something authentic. She's like a caged animal. I don't think that there is a loss of consciousness or contact because she's in contact with people. She appears to respond to the people who talk to her. It's a striking change in behavior. It's a physiological state. You probably won't have this in somebody who has no religious background. Can I characterize it? Maybe. Can I treat it? No. And Friedkin says he was shocked by their responses because they wouldn't come out and say, of course, this woman is possessed by something, but they were baffled about their ailment. And he says, I went to these doctors to try and get a rational scientific explanation for what I experienced, thinking that they would say this is some sort of psychosomatic disorder, has nothing to do with possessions. And that is not what I came away with at all. He says, 45 years after I directed The Exorcist, there is more acceptance of the possibility of possession than when I made the film. And exorcism, when we talk about it, it's defined as a forcing an unwanted spiritual entity to leave its host. And in history, belief in possession by spirits shows up in around 31 BC in the Sumerian culture of ancient Mesopotamia, in the area which is now Kuwait, Syria, and Iraq. And then we see possession by spirits in the New Testament. And we're in this series right now, Jesus, Believe It or Not, where we're talking about some of the strange, disturbing, or confusing stories of Jesus, of things he said and things he did. And there is perhaps no more puzzling or shocking story than the story of Jesus when he meets a demoniac man in the tombs of Gerasenes and uses a herd of pigs in their exorcism. Now, this story has puzzled and confused people for centuries. And today's passage, it's going to come from the Gospel of Mark. And when we look at the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Mark contains the most stories of exorcism. One scholar noted that if the Gospel of Mark were modern day writing, the presence and style of the story would prompt us to believe that Stephen King was involved. Even the title of the story, The Gerasenes Demoniac, sounds like the name of a horror movie or maybe a metal death band. But for many, fighting demons is relegated to the movies or to something that happened centuries and ages ago but doesn't occur today. And I agree that when I have read this passage before, I haven't really known what to believe or how to make sense of a passage like this because it raises a myriad of questions. Were demons real? Are they real? Or was it just some way of explaining mental disorders or psychosomatic afflictions that they didn't have verbiage for in those days that we maybe now can understand? And what happens in biblical scholarship when you read about this passage is that it tends to devolve into a debate between the reality of supernatural creatures and mental health. But for a writer like Mark, when he's writing his gospel, the question that Mark is not asking, the issue is not for him, do demons exist? The question that he is asking is, how does one get rid of them? Because that really is the most important question. Because whether you are Christian, agnostic, atheist, Baptist, charismatic, Methodist, Catholic, the understanding of wrestling with our demons is something that we can all relate to. So when we look at this passage in the Gospel of Mark, we're going to find it when it starts in Mark chapter 5, but it is also mentioned in Matthew and Luke. Now, in the previous chapters before we get to this story, Jesus has been teaching to the crowds in Galilee. And after he teaches to the crowds, he tells the disciples to get into the boat and that they're going to sail across to the other side of the sea. Then what happens is probably the more popular and famous story of Jesus when a storm comes. Jesus is napping and the disciples wake Jesus up. And with his words, Jesus calms the sea and calms the storm. And then immediately after that story, when they safely make it to the other side, it tells us in Mark chapter 5, verse 1. They came to the other side of the sea, to the region of Gerasenes. And when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. So Jesus meets this man with an unclean spirit, which is the Jewish phrase for possession. And in Jewish tradition, he is in the tombs. And the tombs were considered kind of a resort for possession, for evil spirits. And in addition to the tombs being unclean and this man being unclean, the area that they're in, Gerasenes, this territory, it kind of underlines the theme of uncleanliness because in Jewish eyes, this Gentile territory, which means it's not Jewish at all, would have been considered unclean. And so we don't know why Jesus would choose to get in a boat and to leave Galilee, to sail across the sea, to enter into an unclean Gentile territory. But what we know about Jesus, and what I love about Jesus, is that he has a way of showing up in the places of profound human suffering. Places where no one else is willing to go, to see people that no one else is willing to see. And he enters into the suffering of others. And this man, he is suffering greatly. He is tormented. He is isolated. He is ostracized. He is living among death, living among the dead. And what happens when this man sees Jesus, it tells us in verse 6 that when he sees Jesus from a distance, he ran and he bowed down before him. And he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." So this man's unclean spirit recognizes Jesus immediately, and he recognizes him as a threat. And so he runs to him not to be cured, but to protect himself. The demoniac says, "I adjure you by God, do not torment me." And the word adjure, I did have to look it up, means to command solemnly as if under oath. It's also used in the book of Acts when an exorcism is conducted by Paul. And so this unclean spirit is trying to command Jesus to protect himself, to stay in the man. And here's how Jesus responds. Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." So one of the questions that we have about this story is to whom Jesus is asking the question. Was he asking the question to the man, or was he asking the question to the spirit that possessed the man? And it's a little ambiguous in how he asks the question. He says, "What is your name?" But the distinction is important because the man's answer determines if he's defined by who he is or if he's defined by the demons that haunt him. And I wonder, in this man's life, in the torment and the affliction and the suffering that he had faced, how long had it been since he heard his name? How long had it been since someone asked him his name? Because you see, when someone is banished and ostracized and sent out from community, that person no longer is Tom or Sam or Henry or Harry. That person now is labeled madman, crazy person, afflicted, possessed. And the thing that we see in the Gospels with Jesus, when we see him moving towards those people, the people who have been ostracized, the people who have been cast aside, those are the people who can become nameless. And I think in our society today, we have people who suffer in that same way, people who become nameless. I took a class in seminary about the growing epidemic of the unhoused, which I learned is the preferred way of speaking of those who are suffering from homelessness. And I was convicted by the idea that when someone is unhoused, they become nameless. How many times had I been in a city and walked by someone, or even here in our city, or driven by someone and thought of them as homeless, the homeless man, the homeless woman. They were defined by their situation. You think about it, how it happens with people who are incarcerated. They're no longer named individuals. They become a number, and they become defined by their identity as imprisoned. Or if you have ever known anybody in your life who has suffered with addiction, how easy it is to label them by that: alcoholic, addict. The thing I wonder, when Jesus is here and Jesus is seeing this man and he's looking at him, I wonder if this man even remembers his name, or if he has only become defined by his demons. Frederick Buechner wrote, "If someone forgets my name, I feel it is I who have been forgotten." And this question, I think it shows us something about the nature of Jesus. You see, when this man approaches Jesus and Jesus sees him, Jesus doesn't see him as a terror. He doesn't see him as someone to avoid, someone to cast aside, someone to become nameless. What Jesus sees him as is a member of humanity, a suffering person of humanity, a person before their affliction. And that's how Jesus sees us. He doesn't see us defined by our sin. He doesn't see us defined by what we struggle with. Jesus sees us for who we are, and he cares about each one of us individually. And so he asks, "What is your name?" And then we find out in the response that the answer is Legion. And this reveals that the man had become so possessed that he was defined by his demons, and more than one, because Legion was not a solitary demon. Legion was a collective. And so what happens then in verse 10 is that he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the region. Now there on the hillside, a great herd of swine was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine and the herd, numbering about 2,000, stampeded down the steep bank into the sea, and were drowned in the sea. Now, this is the part that always raises some eyebrows, because why do the demons beg to enter the pigs? So we know this. We know that the demons recognize that they have no power against Jesus. And so these demons, what we know about them from the Bible, is that when it comes to the methods that demons used, or spirits, that what they traffic in is illusion, fear, rage, terror, darkness, and those things do not withstand the power of God. So you have these demons, and they look around, and in their frantic search to find a way not to be exorcised forever, but to be able to stay in the region, they choose their method of destruction. They see these pigs, and they say, let us just go live in the pigs. And so Jesus honors that request. He sends them into the pigs, and then the poor pigs, they have a reaction. They're shocked and terrified, so they just decide to run off a cliff and then drown. 2,000 pigs, it's a lot of pigs. And so there's this tendency when it comes to this wild way that these demons were exorcised, is to try to find meaning in the pigs. Why did they choose this method? Is there more symbolism? Is there something else to this type of exorcism? We really don't know. But here is what we do know from this passage, is that one encounter with Jesus, and this man was set free. That it just took one touch of the mercy and grace of Jesus for this man to go from a lost, tormented soul to a man who was whole in his mind, in his body, and his soul. And I want you to know this today, that there is no limit to what Jesus will do to free you. That there is no place too dirty, no place unclean, no place too unsightly for Jesus to go to find you. There are no links that he won't go to in order to free you from what holds you in bondage, from what torments you, from what keeps you from a life of freedom and wholeness and abundance, because Jesus came to free us from the lifeless tombs of our life. It only takes one encounter with Jesus. And you would think that after seeing this miracle, after witnessing what Jesus did, that the people who saw it, that they would rejoice, that they would celebrate this miracle. But that is not what happens. Instead, fear begins to spread. And the people's response is this: the swineherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the man possessed by demons sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had the legion, and they became frightened. Those who had seen what happened to the man possessed by demons and to the swine reported it, and then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. So you see, the people, they had gotten used to Legion, ignoring him and mistreating him. And when Jesus destroyed or sent the swine to their death, well, he disrupted the whole economy of their community. And well, that demonic man was not really worth it. You see, 2,000 pigs, that would have been a tremendous cost. And the Gospel of Matthew seems to suggest that what the people were afraid of is they were afraid that they would lose more livestock if Jesus stayed with them and did more exorcisms. You see, the people, what they had done is they had counted up the cost, and it was too high. And the truth is that Jesus' good news to the poor, to the imprisoned, to the captive, is often perceived as a threat to the rich, the safe, the comfortable, and secure. You see, the cost of freeing this man, the cost of giving this man mercy, was the price of the swine. Mercy, it comes with a cost. It is not free. And for us to receive mercy, Jesus had to lose his life. But I also wonder if when they see the man there, whole, restored, reasonable, right, completely healed, clothed, not tormented, I wonder if part of their fear comes from the fact that they know their capabilities, they know what they're able to cure, they know how to handle people who are outside of their realm of understanding, and they had long since labeled this man beyond hope. They had moved out what they could not control. And then comes along this man named Jesus, a man with a power so great that he could stop the wind, that he could calm the storm, that he could exorcise demons with his words. And that type of power was a threat to the way of life. That type of power was something that they could not explain. And that type of power seemed to come with too high of a cost for them. And so they rejected him. And they ask him to leave. And in a lot of ways, we can do that in our own lives. We can say that we want a life that Jesus will give us, that we want to live a life of surrender, that we want to follow him, that we want all of the things that we hear about when we're committing our life to Jesus, that we want that kind of life. But when we start to count the cost, what we might have to give up, what we might have to change about our lives, we can also often decide that that cost is just too high. And we, like the people, can reject Jesus. Because the thing about Jesus is he's not going to force himself and force his way into our lives. He will pursue us. He will call us. He will love us. He will extend his grace to us. But we have to be the ones who are willing to invite him into our lives. So when the people reject Jesus, he leaves. He honors their request and he leaves. It tells us that as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by the demons begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." And he went away and he began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. So the Decapolis was known as 10 cities. It was mainly inhabited by Gentiles, non-Jewish people, and it was under Greek influence. And so the man, he wants to go with Jesus, but instead Jesus makes him an evangelist. He says, "Go and tell your people what God has done for you and the mercy he has shown you." He has turned this man from a madman into a missionary, a person who goes and tells of what God has done in their life. And these are the words that Jesus has for us today. Because we all have a story. We all have a story to tell. It may not be as dramatic as the demoniac man who was exorcised. Your life probably doesn't involve a herd of swine. But you do have a story. Anyone who has been freed, who knows the love and the grace and the mercy of Jesus in their lives has a story to tell, and it is a story that our world needs to hear. So in the words of Jesus, I tell you today to go and tell of what God has done in your life and the great mercy that he has shown you. Let me pray for us. God, we thank you and praise you this morning that you would look upon us, look upon our humanity to see us in our suffering, and that you would send your son Jesus to enter into suffering with us, that he would become a man, that he would live, that he would experience the struggles in the life that we experience, and that he would be willing to go to the cross for us, so that through his sacrifice, through his crucifixion and resurrection, that we don't have to walk through suffering alone, and that we know a life of freedom and joy and wholeness and peace and abundance. God, I pray right now for anyone who has come here today who is wrestling with demons, whether that is an addiction, whether that is a struggle, whether that is a suffering, whether that is a difficulty in a relationship. God, wherever it is, you know the hearts of the people who are here today and the hearts of those who are listening online. God, I pray right now that you would, just as you did the demoniac man right now, that you would send those demons fleeing, that you would bring about healing and restoration in their lives, that you would provide provision and the miracles that need to happen. God, that you would heal people, that you would break the chains of whatever holds them in bondage, and they would walk out of here today people who have been freed by the grace and the mercy of Jesus Christ. God, we declare your goodness. We declare your power. We declare your mercy and your grace today, and the love that you have for each one of us, that no matter what we've done, that you never see us in that way, that you came not to condemn us, but to set us free. God, we thank you. We praise you in the mighty name of Jesus today. Amen.